ones?
Yeah.
I bet that was
This one has
the 1 to 8.
really nice texture.
Good evening.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Kaylee. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Louisville Public Library. And we are very happy to have Susan Hess here tonight. She's going to be speaking about her project that she worked on all through the pandemic. And I mean, you know, it is representations of the G's Bend quilts, which is, it's just crazy cool. And she knows a lot more about what she's talking about. She is a Maine artist, fiber, and well,
Fiber and fiber.
yeah, I mean, to do this is, it's something, you know, it's a visual artistry. So I'm gonna let her talk a little bit more about everything. I'm just here to admire.
Thank you. My appreciation to Kaylee for arranging this exhibit, and also my friend Leslie Good for her support. And she is the one who brought my project to Kaylee's attention. And thank you for being here, and welcome to all who might be watching virtually. I'll give you a brief overview. I'd like to tell you a little bit about G's Bend, and of course about the quilters and their art, and how my project unfolded. And then I have a few thoughts about oral literature, and I'll close with some personal reflections. Within the Black Belt region of Alabama, there's a small tract of land, about 3 miles square, surrounded on 3 sides by the Alabama River. It's called G's Bend. The last census showed something less than 300 people. In 1930, a ferry was established that provided a 15-minute ride from G's Bend across the river to the nearest town of Camden. The only alternative route out of G's Bend was a 9-mile road connecting the 2 towns. And it was said that it took almost an hour by car. In the early 1800s, Joseph G's came from North Carolina with 18 slaves and bought a piece of ground on G's Bend and opened the first cotton plantation. When he died, he gave his estate to his 2 nephews, which included 47 enslaved Blacks. And they subsequently sold the land to Mark Petway, who was a resident of G's Bend. Following emancipation, the Black population stayed on the plantation and worked as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. During the Great Depression in the 1920s, the price of cotton plummeted. By the early 1930s, the collectors were coming to G's Bend to foreclose on their debtors. There was no money, but they took their possessions as well as their tools and even some of their food. Had it not been for the rations of the Red Cross, these people would have died. Finally, the federal government and the Farm Security Administration became involved, and from 1937 until 1940, 100 Roosevelt project houses were built on G's Bend, as well as a school, a store, a clinic, a cotton mill, and a cotton gin and a mill, excuse me. At that time, tracts of land were sold or rented to the G's Bend residents. But what has given G's Bend worldwide recognition are their quilt makers and their art. While G's Bend quilts carry forward the old and proud tradition of textiles made for family and home, we must remember that these quilt makers were transforming recycled work clothes, dresses, fabric remnants, and feed sacks into coverings to keep themselves and their children warm in unheated shacks that lacked running water, telephones, and electricity. Nevertheless, few other places can boast the extent of the G's Bend artistic achievement, the result of geographic isolation, chronic economic hardship, and an unusual degree of cultural continuity. Works were found by 3 and 4 generations of women in the same family. Flexible patterning and improvisation are a matter of pride to the G's Bend quilters, something individual and different, often a consequence of technique. Most pieces are not measured, they're just cut or torn by eye. the abundance of scraps and the inverse, the scarcity of any single fabric, provided the juxtaposition of color, texture, irregular patterns, and contours. These women learned to see and exploit every subtlety of found cloth. Beyond the means of mere survival, there was a spiritual dimension to their quilts. They recycled what were often the only remaining possessions of deceased parents, spouses, children, siblings, thus holding the power and memory of departed loved ones. What is difficult in describing the Gee's Bend quilts is that there's a dark underside to this art. The beauty and nuance within which these dull work clothes resonate with the enforced outer plainness of Southern rural African-American life in the Jim Crow South. If Gee's Bend quilts could be the sites of private dreams and escape, these work clothes sing in the double voice of the modest and inspired. But lest we forget, they represent a desperate effort to keep warm with scraps and are made of the very stuff that African Americans were enslaved to produce and grown out of the ground that they were forced to clear and work. During the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, the March on Washington and the Voting Rights Act, Gee's Bend Blacks were taking a ferry across the river to Camden in order to register to vote. In 1962, ferry service was eliminated. In 1965, Martin Luther King came to Gee's Bend and preached in Pleasant Grove Baptist Church. Many of the residents marched with him to Selma, and many lost their jobs. And mind you, it was not until 2006 that the ferry service was reestablished. That meant for 40 years, over 40 years, the only way that these people had access to the mainland was the 9-mile road. And it doesn't surprise me, and I don't find it coincidental, that it was 2006 that the ferry service opened, because that was also the year that the United States Postal Service issued a set of commemorative 39-cent stamps entitled American Treasures, Quilts of Gee's Bend. And these stamps are the impetus for my project. In the fall of 2008, I visited the Philadelphia Museum of Art to see the exhibit entitled Gee's Bend, the Architecture of the Quilt. I saw the Gee's Bend quilts as gospel weavings portraying reality, struggle, truth, and music. I studied the history of the exhibits and Gee's Bend and marveled at the quantity and beauty of the art that their quilt makers brought into being through individual, communal, and generationally passed on traditions. It's a mystery to me how creative seeds are sowed, but I knew I wanted to work with the Gee's Bend quilts. So I went home, worked at my loom, and struggled very unsuccessfully. And in 2010, a friend sent me a set of the Gee's Bend stamps, which I had never seen. So I wove, and by 2013, I had embroidered 3.5, but convinced I could never complete all 10, I abandoned the project. The isolation of the 2020 COVID pandemic provided the remote hours and the Black Lives Matter movement the provocation for me to take up the project once again. Unlike the communal and intergenerational work of the Gee's Bend quilters, my project has been an individual process, a leap of faith in many respects. When I wasn't weaving or embroidering, I was reading about the biographies of the individual creators of these stamps. And I was also reading the literature of Black women, both authors and poets. And I've used excerpts of their work to introduce the weavings in my book. When I was weaving or cross-stitching, frequently I was listening to jazz or Black opera or books on tape by Black authors. But it was the hours in the silence of solitude that invited me to introspectively navigate my own history of prejudice and privileged whiteness. And through the combination of these different awarenesses, the stitching, the reading, the listening, and the contemplation, that my project just developed an identity. And as a result, the creative seeds sprouted as miniature echoes that adopted names. I'd like to give you an example, and I'm going to use vulnerable. I picked up my work one morning and I looked at it and I couldn't believe it. It was as though someone else had been stitching on my weaving. There was a whole set of horizontal lines that were supposed to be vertical. It was my 7th stamp. I was more than 3/4 of the way through, and I knew the error couldn't be corrected, and I was open to failure. But I thought what I would do is go back and look at my notes about the woman who had created that particular design. And her name was Loretta Petway. She was just 4 years older than I. And this is what she had to say. I didn't like to sew, didn't want to do it. I had a handicapped brother and I had to struggle. Had to walk about 50 miles in the field every day. Get home, too tired to do no sewing. My grandmama told me, you better make quilts. You're going to need them. I said, I ain't going to need no quilts. But when I got me a raggedy old house, then I needed them to keep warm. So I just thought 50 miles in the fields, a handicapped brother. And so that particular piece adopted the name Vulnerable. And to introduce it in my book, I used an excerpt from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Then they had grown, edging into life from the back door, becoming. Everybody in the world was in a position to give them orders. White women said, do this. White children said, give me that. White men said, come here. Black men said, lay down. The only people they need not take orders from were Black children and each other. But they took all of that and recreated it in their own image. They ran the houses of white people and knew it. When white men beat their men, they cleaned up after and went home to receive abuse from the victim. They beat their children with one hand and stole for them with the other. The hands that felled trees also cut umbilical cords. The hands that wrung the necks of chickens and butchered hogs also nudged African violets into bloom. The arms that loaded cheese in bales and sacks rocked babies into sleep. They patted biscuits into flaky ovals of innocence and shrouded the dead. They plowed all day and came home to nestle like plums under the limbs of their men. The legs that straddled a mule's back were the same ones that straddled their men's hips. And the difference was all the difference there was. It was last year that in the fall that I first visited the Blue Hill Public Library, and even in the midst of the pandemic, it was obvious that this was a library that provided resources, services, and exhibits in a variety of media for the educational and personal development of the children, the youth, and the adults of this community. I read on the Blue Hill website that in 1860, the Ladies' Social Library of Blue Hill was organized, and they met weekly to, quote, exchange books and eat ice cream. I remember the year 1860 because in 1859, Dinah Miller, who was the first identified quilter of Gee's Bend, was delivered to Africa on an outlaw slave ship, to Alabama on an outlaw slave ship from Africa. I'd like to think, however, that it was she who organized the women of Gee's Bend, not to exchange books and eat ice cream, but to make quilts and to exchange and share in conversation that is the oral history that has provided us with the insight into how these women and their communities survived the forces of history. Oral literature travels through words and speaking and does not have a single author, but instead is authored by the people's culture as their mutually shared legends and stories. Written literature has a permanent record in the form of books, while oral literature narratives are passed on one generation to another by word of mouth. The most surprising difference between the two, both in terms of composition and recitation, is the method of recollection and transmission of a work of literature when writing does not play a role. However, song and poetry did play a role. Without the aid of reading and writing, the Gee's Bend oral tradition included transmission through singing and verse. The church was second only to the quilters gathering as their social network, and these women could sing and recite hundreds of lines of hymns and sermons, often improvised. I could not have spent the hundreds of hours replicating the designs made by these women without trying to conceptualize what it must be like to grow up and to live in a world dominated by another race of people. I went to school in Boston for a year, and I lived in the south end of the city in the YWCA with Black women. Through my professional career, I had many Black male and female friends and associates with whom I worked, socialized, and entertained in my home. And I'm embarrassed to say that I feel today I have never really known a Black person, nor do I imagine any lens that I might be able to look through to understand or begin to understand their struggle. What I have learned is that people of African descent, like other diasporic groups, have contributed and deeply influenced American culture and society. I will never experience an anti-racist society, nor will my son. But acknowledging that it will take a hell of a lot more than our collective minds and sheer wills to confront racist oppression, I can only have hope for my 2 grandsons and my 2 great-granddaughters. Creativity is a powerful and important influence in all of our lives, regardless of race or color, and it comes naturally if we let it. Whether you're in your kitchen or your sewing room or your garden or your workshop or your library or your knitting group or your music room, our world is a better place when we live imaginatively, using our eyes and our ears and our voices and our talents, and what I fear is becoming the lost art, our hands. I trust the process of creative energy. I believe that everyone has it, and that it carries with it a responsibility. The next generations need and deserve to be guided and taught. And it is one way that we can be of benefit in a world that needs love. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Comments?
Thank you.
Okay.
Is this
Yes.
needlepoint or cross stitch?
No, this is counted cross stitch. They're all counted cross stitch, except when I got to inequities. And these panels, it was impossible for me to do the counted cross stitch. So I wove the back one part, and then I embroidered the 3 panels. And they were called, the original quilt is called, I think, panels. So that kind of gave me a hint. So that's the only one that is not counted cross stitch.
It was so fine when I was looking at it earlier that I thought, could there be an X there? It was so fine, I couldn't tell that. I thought, no.
And they're almost all X's. I had 2 that in some instances, the lines were so thin that it's just one stitch. But I wove the mats that they are, that they're cross stitched on. And so the weaving was tight enough that I could use a half of an X, actually, is the easiest way to say, to do the lines that were really, really skinny, which is what I had originally planned to do. Inequities was the 10th stamp, the last one that I did. And that's what I originally intended to do. But I just couldn't make it work, so.
It's so fine. Most people have to stop doing cross stitch on a much larger scale because their eyes just can't see it anymore.
It has a lot to do with friends who give you really wonderful magnifying glasses and lights. It makes a big difference. The light makes a big difference.
So the fabric that you made that you did the cross stitch on,
Mhm.
that, you wove that, was that linen?
That's linen, sometimes 22 linen, sometimes 42 linen. When I was in a mood to try to really challenge myself, I used a 42 linen because it's much smaller, so that then I was hoping to make a much smaller piece. I'm just trying to think. So compassion is one that's done on a 42 linen, and take to be is done on a 42.
Take to be?
Take to be. Take to be.
So you wove all the linen up?
So I wove all the linen, yes. Yeah. When you buy material on which to cross stitch, it's not sure that I can, it's pretty secure. And so in order to do this and bring any kind of, movement to the piece, so to speak, by weaving my own, I could move the lines a little bit or, and make it work a lot differently. I could never have done it on bought, I don't know what you call them, mats, is that what you call them? So, yeah.
So, and tell us about the threads that you use.
The threads are just cotton, from Joann's.
Oh, it is?
DMC.
It's not cloth?
Yes. Mhm.
DMC.
Yep, DMC, yeah. And I had another good friend who helped me a lot with colors. That was difficult, but, yeah.
Susan, I know it's hard to ask.
What?
Do you have a favorite?
I know, that is, it's really, it is, because,
Good question.
Kathy, yeah, it is a good question, and.
Well, as a quilter, as somebody who makes a lot of quilts.
Yeah,
it's,
yeah, yeah.
Like, do you
You
have a favorite?
yeah.
And
yeah.
I guess sometimes you do.
And
And sometimes you like some better than others,
Yeah, right.
depending on what
What was
when you
going
were
on
working
when
on
it happened, and
exactly.
how difficult was it to make,
Yeah.
and do I really like my colors? And so the one that was most challenging is probably compassion, and this was number 9. And I really like how it turned out. So compassion is one of my favorites. The other thing that has a big effect on how I answer that question is that in choosing the names and in choosing the verses in my book, I just have some verses that I just absolutely love. I'll give you a couple of examples. Sea color. Now, that one is this. This is the other thing. This is kumihimo. I don't know if you know kumihimo, but it's the Japanese art of making braids. So these are the verses that I chose to introduce sea color. In complete darkness, we are all the same. It is only our knowledge and wisdom that separates us. Don't let your eyes deceive you. And this one, I have 3 for this one. Look within, there is no end. And the third one by Alice Walker. I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. So that sometimes when I just found the right take to be. My grandmother and my aunts were an exhibition in resilience and resourcefulness and Black womanhood. They rarely talked about the unfairness of the world with the words that I use now with my social justice friends. Words like intersectionality, equality, oppression, discrimination. They didn't discuss those things because they were too busy living it, navigating it, surviving it. So, and that was one joy that I had in making the note cards, because on the back of the note cards, I've taken one of the excerpts from the from Black literature for each one of them. So that was another aspect of it that was really challenging but enjoyable. So
Are those also handmade? I mean,
no, those
Those
are
are-
pictures of these.
okay.
So the picture on the front is my weaving, and then the
Okay.
picture on the back is the stamp.
Great.
Yeah, yeah. And in my book, I have taken real care to introduce. So in the book sort of works like this, and this is a picture of the stamp, and then the original quilt shown on the stamp and the title of it and the person who designed it, and also the size. So I really try to introduce the stamp first, and then my weaving and the size of my weaving. So yeah, I was really careful. Yeah.
Your combination of black hand, white hand.
Oh, the
That's
cover
yours.
of the book. Yes, and this was I designed it myself, but my stepson is an artist, and he painted it for me. And as only he could do, he did the whole thing as though they were stamps. So every one of these every one of these pieces of the quilt, piece of quilt, the edges are all as though they were stamps. And what we decided to do, because we couldn't decide, so on the front of the book, the black hand is on the top, the white on the bottom, and then on the back of the book, the hands are working side by side. So
Lovely.
it was,
So working side by side, were any of the quilts done by more than one person?
oh, the quilts were always 3 and 4 generations of family. But generally speaking, what they do is they put the pieces together individually. So that one person works just to put the pieces together. But then it's the stretching it out and the stuffing of it and the actual quilting of it. So the pieces are sewn together frequently by one person. But it was the quilting that the children, and you can see pictures if you wish to look in the books, but you can see pictures of them sitting around tables, and the little ones would be underneath. And they tell stories about the 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds who just couldn't wait until they had an opportunity to sit and to stitch. And so they're just wonderful intergenerational family stories. It's just very, very moving, all of it. So,
Well, and G. Spence quilts have become real collectibles. Museums have them.
yeah, oh, right,
Yeah.
right. They've been in museums all over the world, as literally. So, thank you. Thank you. Oh,
Will
you're
this be-
welcome.
Will this be here for a while, or is it going
No,
on
it's not,
tonight?
no, it's just a one-day exhibit. The kids'
Thanks.
art is here, so
Is there a permanent home for the originals altogether?
These,
No, the original,
quilts.
yes.
You know, I think what has happened is, no, I'm wrong. There are some people, so much has happened with G's bed quilts since they became popular. I mean, they are now, you know, Ralph Lauren, Kathy probably can tell you. Frank, okay,
Right.
sorry, has, is making clothes out of the designs. So there are some quilters who, and understandably so, who, sell their work to it, just pieces of fabric. I mean, just, you know, for, slip covers, and now clothing is becoming very popular.
Good design.
But then there are still the women that, this is how I see it, is that these women made these quilts and there were no patterns. And there was, as I said, there was an abundance of scraps, but there was a scarcity of large pieces. And so every single one of them is different. And then when Miss John Brown comes and buys 25 quilts for some ridiculous amount of money and goes to New York and sells them, and they decide it's art. And so now Sears and Roebuck introduced corduroy to them, Bloomingdale, Saks Fifth Avenue. And so there was a group, it was actually a collective, and they said, okay, we'll send you material, we'll send you patterns, and we'll pay you a lot of money. And so now there is this two ways of thinking about it, and there are people in G's Bend who make materials and quilts for various things. And then there still are the other people who say that, you know, their patterns are their patterns. That's my heart. That's my soul. I don't want to use somebody. I don't want those little itty bitty pieces. I don't want somebody to tell me what fabric. That's not what this is about. So there's and as I say, you can understand it when you lived as poorly as they've lived and still live, that it was easy to go and get paid $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 to you know, to supply quilted material.
But like the ones from that you saw in Philadelphia.
All originals.
So, but I mean, are they, did they get sold? Are they in a
Some of
museum?
them,
Or do they
some
live
of them,
somewhere?
some of them get sold. Museums, many museums have bought them. I know that the Boston Museum of Art has them. They just had an exhibit called the Fabric of a Nation, Marco, I think it was. But yeah,
Yeah.
and so they, pardon?
Smithsonian, I've seen.
And right,
Where?
the Smithsonian, yeah,
Even
and
before Philly. had it,
yeah,
the
even,
Smithsonian.
right.
So they've tried to keep a few of these together as
They-
a group?
Oh, the museums, how do you answer that, Leslie? The museums, I mean, they're collector's items.
Yes.
So the museums, yes, but I don't think that there's probably a museum that has more than 2 or 3 in their permanent collection.
Right, so they got broken up after
Right,
they.
right. And I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard, whereas, you know, the quilts originally hanging on the clothesline, probably $25 was a gold mine to these people. And today they probably cost $25,000.
Yes.
So it's just,
Well, that's the art world,
that's
isn't it?
exactly right. That's exactly.
And I
right.
think one of the other things too, from quilting, the whole improv, the modern quilt movement too, was something when that started, it was a big recognition that these quilts were all improv, that they are all one of a kind.
One of a kind, individual, and that's an art.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the one story of the granddaughter, I think she was 7 or 8. And she was telling the story about, she used to be underneath the table when everybody came to do the quilting. And then when she attained a certain age, I think it was 7, she was allowed to, and they, as I say, they tore or cut, nobody measured, you know. And so she was allowed to begin her first quilt. And my grandmother told me, the quilt has to start in the middle and it has to have a heart. And so I just thought that was, that was just so beautiful, but they, this is how they survived, this is how they kept warm. It's just an amazing story.
Are there many quilters now still there? I mean, are there a lot, like how many? I mean, is it dozens or hundreds? that are still doing that?
Well, no, well, there's only, the last census says 300 residents. I think there's probably more than that. But even, I would say that maybe on Gee's Bend itself, which is still accessed by the ferry and, and the 9 Mile Road, but there are women there who are still quilting, and you can go down, and they even have quilting classes, but there is what's known as I believe this is the correct, but the cooperative is in Camden. So and I think it's called the Gee's Bend Collective Guild or something like that. So if you go to Camden, you can see Gee's Bend quilts, but you would probably also see what I refer to as modern quilts. If you want to see the old authentic quilts, but you could go to Gee's Bend and you could see these, because now, I mean, they used to be in the home, but as I said, in the 40s, then they got a room, they got a school, and so then there was a place where they could all go and quilt. But yeah, I'm told you can go to Gee's Bend and take the ferry, and we
Have you
haven't
been
done it
there?
yet, but no,
Oh,
it's perhaps out there. But, well, thank you very much for your interest.
Oh, thank
and I
you.
It's just fun to share. So.
Do you want to show these again?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Do you have a itinerary?
No. I have one other show. The pandemic has really been, a setback, but this is, and I said this to Kaylee, but this is a beginning. And so now I can, go to other libraries and, we'll see what happens. I don't know, but, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for.
Thank
So
you.
I'm gonna-